Welcome everyone who is joining us for our webinar today, wherever you are in the world. It's currently 5 p.m. here in Stradbroke Island in Queensland, Australia. And I would like to start by acknowledging the Quandamooka people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I currently am. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging from the Quandamooka people from Stradbroke Island. Welcome to today's webinar, which will highlight some very interesting research looking at the science communication research field, something that is burgeoning and increasing, and something that it's important for us to understand where the gaps are, what is happening in research, and where it might go in the future. So welcome to today's session. Later on in the program, there will be an opportunity for people to ask questions using the Q&A function. Please use that Q&A function, and you can actually vote for questions that you like. And I will be looking at the questions that get the most votes, because no doubt we'll be running short of time. I would like to hand over now to my colleague, Professor Alex Gerber from the University of Rhine-Waal in Germany, and also Director of INSCICO, to present about the results from the research study. Before I do, if you want to tweet about this, we do encourage you to use the hash SciComm as a tag in your tweeting. Or if you're in India, you might like to use the hash SciComm Sci tag. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for kicking us off, and just so great to see all of you, including in the meantime, 44 viewers, I believe. I think it's so important in these strange, awkward times, which seem less awkward, I think, down under as they still are in Europe, that we do get together, at least virtually. I'm going to share a few slides in just a minute about the science communication research field analysis. The overall question we want, I believe, to address from a European perspective this evening, on the other side of the world, is whether science communication research, SCR in short, has matured to be called a field in its own right. And if so, like any other research field coming of age, should we then ask which are the patterns that have characterized its developments over the decades, which topics are or have been what we probably call trending nowadays, and which methodologies are used. So this is what motivated this in-depth field analysis we're discussing today. To avoid misunderstandings, the idea was not to criticize SCR for, let's say, potential shortcomings, or to take the glass is only half full approach. Instead, this is an empirical analysis to enrich the discussion that would otherwise, or has otherwise, often been limited to opinions about what we are doing, should be doing, should not be doing, should not be focusing on. So it's an empirical underpinning, and we've done our best to share those results and recommendations as widely as possible. Study has been published as an ebook, fully open access, as an audiobook, and you have the link actually down here. There has been a blog post, A Public Understanding of Science Online, a Twitter storm with somewhat 20 little episodes, and a series of webinars, this year being the second one today. If you intend to tweet, as Jenny already said, please consider using the hashtags, and you can also use our Twitter handle here. That's the Institute for Science and Innovation Communication Center, where I'll be responding in person about this event. I'll be summarizing the main points from the study in, let's say, the coming 20 minutes, as indicated below, starting with the methodology. On the right-hand side, also our project team, and including the external advisors. Well, for the first time, this bibliometric analysis coded the actual content of more than 3,000 scholarly publications. It wasn't just analysis of who published or where things were published. We used for that 7 different samples. 4 of them were actually total population ones. And for comparative reasons, we deliberately went beyond the 3 core SciComm journals that came to mind first and foremost when we asked those, I believe, 36 international experts to rank the most relevant outlets in the field. That's why we added Nature, Science, and even the Scientific American here. And in addition, also we included this selection of 79 so-called major works, a volume edited by Brian Trench and Massimiliano Bucchi. The list on there shows the distribution and the ranking of those experts of the journals. And doesn't even include journals such as Frontiers in Communication, for example, which I believe is now among the leading ones, which at the time wasn't really a thing, even when we started the analysis a couple of years ago. So with tens of thousands of project reports, which may also need to be mentioned, and conference proceedings, books, blog posts, I suppose we need to add today, we could only really scrape the surface. It's literally a big data challenge for which both a purely semantic approach and a keyword search had previously proven methodologically insufficient, which is why we have been thinking a lot about how to continue from here. This is why the follow-up project to our first field analysis is now taking a machine learning approach in which we will use the, let's say, intellectually coded data from this study here to calibrate an automated categorization of thousands of other papers and documents methodologically that should be comparable in terms of reliability, which of course is fundamentally important, and additionally then extending the scope to much more multilingual analyses, which is also important to include Spanish and Portuguese, Mandarin, Japanese, to mention just a few. So this is what we're talking about today is also just an important first step on a journey. The gray literature is a pretty bottomless undertaking, as already said, because there's just so much more, and that particularly comes from the project reports, of which there are so many out there. And as I said here, the big data approach will define the follow-up project. Without further ado, of course, the content analysis conducted on the quantitative side was calibrated with a randomized and stratified sample of about 7% of the data. Then we calculated the intercoder reliability at the end of what were 9 research assistants coding and calculating, and we used Krippendorff's alpha here on a nominal scale at the time. And obviously not just looking for which journal published under which title and author in which country, but also, and that is where vast amount of the work came in, that every individual paper, everyone several times was coded for variables such as the context in which it appeared, the discipline, the methods being used, and so on. You can again see how that triangulated up there in the overall methodological design. We also included some 2 online surveys, the gray literature analysis, which I was mentioned just now, and 2 series of interviews, because then of course we wanted to contextualize all of that. And again, this is a who's who list on there, which doesn't just reflect and represent leading experts in the field, but also, as far as I understand and hope, also the international global diversity of the fields. Our study provides evidence that science communication research has matured as an academic field. Not only has the absolute number of journal papers increased significantly, particularly in those last 15 years of analysis, but this is especially the case for research studies, compared, for instance, to commentaries or essays, which still are common, but the proportion of those research studies has increased over from a median of 24% before the year 2000, where we only had 7 research studies in total, to a median of 37%. Since 2000, there was 43 studies in total. What is higher than ever before is the variety of institutions, techniques, variety of disciplines in SCR, which contributes to the field's diversity, which we may need to discuss because it may also indicate a lack of maybe a clear theoretical framing. Our study has then identified here those 10 we called grand challenges. Let me just zoom in a handful of those in the interest of time, because we want to have time to discuss the first one here. is that most research papers have reported one-off studies compared to only 3% having a longitudinal design, a proportion that has even declined in the past 5 years. So pre-post studies seem to be the limit for longitudinal design. You could say this is why the study asks if the field is constrained by cross-sectional work on the use of certain tools, certain cultural contexts for certain research areas, which of course limits the generalizability of the endeavors to some extent. More longitudinal, more comparative, more systemic research. So what the study argues is therefore needed to understand how contents and channels interrelate, how actors and audiences interrelate. So do not look at individual aspects, but ideally at all of them at the same time, or many of them. This will most likely also require more openness regarding the methodology, such as the use of data mining to analyze large data sets, which for the time being is also something we don't really see in the field. As multidisciplinary as it is, the fragmentation also comes with the risk of being caught in established disciplinary structures and habits. The scientific communities such as media studies, marketing, sociology of science, social psychology often use quite different jargon. They present their results at different conferences. They publish in different journals. These opportunities of an interdisciplinary integration, which obviously is different from the multidisciplinary nature of the field. So the integration of different research traditions does not really seem to be seized yet, which is what we are also recommending in the study. On the other hand, we could also ask whether that multidisciplinarity is a call for reducing fragmentation, which seems the obvious reactionary approach, or whether it is about learning how to deal with the diversity of the field, which is, I think, fundamentally different. Let me zoom into another one quickly here. In addition to these inner academic challenges of different traditions and disciplines, the field is also affected by a second and potentially much more significant disconnect, and that is the one between scholarship and practice, which hasn't been compared to other disciplines as of yet, but that's another thing that needs to happen next, that we make sure that we also understand how that compares to other fields in social sciences and probably even beyond. So you have scholarship and practice, neither of which takes sufficient notice of the other's priorities, challenges, and solutions, resulting in quite a significant untapped potential for transfer, for collaboration, for more application, implementation of those solutions, even experimentation and action research to be conducted together by scholars and practitioners, as we've seen it, for example, with these tandem research funding programs in the US, where a practitioner and a scholar together apply for a grant. What we've mentioned here, in addition, is also the Manifesto for Evidence-Based Science Communication, which makes specific suggestions how those transfer mechanisms could and should be redesigned. One of the important additional aspects raised there is that an empirically robust understanding of what we're doing, maybe should be doing in SCR, does not necessarily answer the question about the actual research needs in practice. So we can analyze for ourselves as long as we want what we are doing and should be doing and discuss it academically, but that doesn't mean that we systematically analyze what the practitioners community really needs us or would need us to do in addition, or less or more, or a different way. This would require an analysis. For example, we could and should be looking through associations, newsletters such as Excite or RedPop that are discussing at the events and in the newsletters and websites, and ideally even engaging with this community of practice directly to bridge that gap. The original Anglo-American leadership in SCR is still, let's say, a myth that's being conveyed that this is all UK and US. That has been rendered history by the field analysis. Contributions are much more globally diverse nowadays, although overall the long established dominance of particularly those two countries over several decades, of course, still have the legacy. If you look at the top 20 institutions with the largest SCR outputs over time, then there's just one institution which is not located in the US or the UK, 19 of them in those two countries. But having said that, prior to 1995, institutions from just 10 countries contributed to those 3 core SCR journals in any one year, less than 10. Whereas 20 years later, in 2014, articles, which was when it peaked, articles were written by authors from 37 different countries, which is always almost 4 times as many. So we have a diversification of a global authorship, particularly the share of publications by authors from Europe has increased. Figures for the past 5 years, for instance, show that Europe, with 51% of the overall output, is well in front of North America, which is now at 29%. It goes without saying that this distribution would look entirely different if we were to base it on a multilingual data set, which we couldn't and which we haven't yet. So this is only basically just a bird's eye view on SCR in the apparent lingua franca. We may also need to discuss the flip side of that. If we have different publication cultures, for example, in Latin America, in India, in Japan, in China, on SciComm, then there could be a potential risk of isolation for scholarship exclusively published in other languages, which again is something that may need to be bridged. The other one I wanted to quickly zoom into, because we are going to discuss it also in more detail today, is that our study showed that SCR does not necessarily look at the entire spectrum of research. That's also the graph and the tweet, which by far outnumbered anything else we've communicated about this study on social media, even though it has been misinterpreted as nobody's reporting on math, nobody's reporting on the earth sciences, which is where most of the tweets came from. But this is what are the disciplines that the social scientists, that science communication research focuses on. And you can see here a very clear tendency towards biology, here environment, so life sciences at large. And that is even the trend that has increased and not decreased. From these expert interviews, from the research literature analysis, our study has also concluded how and why SCR potentially falls short of addressing those grand challenges. And we summarize those in 4 research gaps. The first one, that's systemic changes into digitalized media to be understood, include recent debates about post-truths and data-driven mass manipulation. In general, science communication often appears more relevant when topics are more controversial. So all of that would need to be analyzed in more detail. New intermediaries in SciComm include pseudo-journalistic media platforms, while independent checks and balances in a democratic sense are replaced. You speak of disintermediation and re-intermediation here. SCR could analyze these systemic changes and experiment with alternative models, including business models. We indicated here that the question, what are policy impacts of all this communication out there, this cacophony, and how can we measure, how can we compare them, including the political influence from pressure groups, formal science engagement for statutory regulation, for example. And 4th, the research funding organizations have expressed that they need more reliable methods to evaluate and compare the role of SciComm in funding calls, what to expect in grant proposals, the specification, and the project outcomes when it's being evaluated. Examples could be RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation in the European context by the European Commission, the REF in the United Kingdom, transfer projects in Germany, and so on. But there are also examples, obviously, in Australia and in South Africa and many other countries. And only then could we fairly and transparently manage and monitor SciComm as part of the research. Yeah, and all of this basically is reflected then in the open access research field analysis in research recommendations. Just maybe as one example, what you will find then is that these are the methods used, and whereas you would maybe expect an increasing diversity, you see that most of the studies in the field still work with surveys. And that led to policy recommendations, which basically said that we need to build the corpus with effective transfer mechanisms, again, something that has also been expressed by the Evidence-Based Science Communication Manifesto, We need to establish well-resourced science communication research hubs, of which there are not even a handful in the world. And we need to increase internationalization and inclusion of global perspectives. So much for the introduction, and back to you, Jenny. Thank you very much to everyone so far for listening.
Thank you very much, Alex. I've asked people if they have questions of clarification so that you could take some of those before we go to the discussants. So we have one question from Wes Ward saying, did your study include PhD theses?
Very good, yeah. No, it didn't. That falls in the same category. I mean, unless they, of course, were published as papers or books, which most aren't. At least the final thesis would be super interesting to look into. But that falls into this big box of also the gray literature. I mean, even more than that, because these are deep dives, I see an even bigger issue with the project reports not being covered. I mean, if these, for example, these Horizon 2020 projects here in Europe often generate a dozen of major research reports over the 3-4 years as they run. Each of those reports might be 100 pages long, so you can say there might be 1,000 pages coming out of one project. We have funded several hundred of these projects, so you have already several 100,000 pages of project reports just from your EU-funded science communication research over the last couple of years. And if you expand that on the global scale, that's why we have a big data issue, but that should and would need to dig into PhD theses as well.
Then we had a question from Tos Gascoigne who actually put it on chat rather than Q&A. And I think you did answer this question, but I'll just repeat it. Do your percentages of high publishing countries take into account those in other languages from India, China, Spanish, Portuguese, and Korea?
Well, good morning, Tos, first of all. Thanks for the question. Great to hear from you, at least in this way. No, it didn't. As mentioned earlier, it should do, however, but that would mean that, of course, from a methodological point of view, it's not just coding things in a different country. You would need to back translate to verify the reliability of the translation. You would have multilingual coding teams. It's a methodological challenge, which we are, however, tackling as we speak, but that'll cost us probably another 2 or 3 years just as this study. And it's not going to be able to do that without the assistance of machine learning and AI.
Okay. There is another question which we'll leave for the more general discussion from Tatiana, who asks about collaboration between researchers and practitioners, but we'll leave that, as she said, to later on in the discussion. And we don't have any other points of clarification at the moment. I do notice on chat that we have people here from the moment from Australia, New Zealand, India, Turkey, Italy, and Philippines. So if you want to put a message on chat and tell us where you're from, that'd be great. But I'd like to welcome our first discussant this evening, my time, this morning where you might be, and that's Dr. Mitsuru Kudo, who's the Assistant Professor at the Center for the Study of Co-Design at Osaka University in Japan. And he's particularly going to look at the dominance of authors from Europe and the USA.
Thank you, Jenny. First of all, my sincere thanks to Alex and his colleagues for this impressive report, as well as for this opportunity to speak in this webinar. So today, my assignment as a discussant is on the dominance of North American and European authors in major English medium outlets of science communication research. The report presents arguments with regard to why we should be concerned, what the likely causes and the impacts are, and how it should be addressed. And they are well evidenced and carefully deliberated on, and I generally agree with most of them. So frankly speaking, I almost feel that there is not much I can add to what has already been argued in the report. That said, I'm going to share with you some of my personal observations on how science communication research in Japan has been developed, particularly in relation to the Western scholarship, so that they will hopefully help us consider how we can make science communication research more globally participated. So very roughly speaking, the primary language used in science communication research in Japan is our most dominant local language, which is Japanese. although there are a few English medium journals where Japanese authors are rather active, it probably is reasonably fair to say that the majority of academic writings on science communication are accessible predominantly in Japanese. But in those published Japanese materials of science communication, Western scholarship is constantly mentioned and often cited as conceptual foundation by many Japanese authors. And European policies, programs, and initiatives have also drawn strong scholarly attention in Japan. So in many ways, we can clearly see a great influence of European and North American science communication on its Japanese counterpart. Given such scholarly proximity, how can we interpret the low visibility of Japanese authors in Anglophone outlets of science communication research, if it is the case? And in the report, as well as in other related commentaries, lack of contributions from other areas than the Europe and North America tends to be framed as an issue of defects in the existing body of knowledge about science communication. And language barriers are often highlighted as one of the major obstacles that discourage non-English speaking scholars from publishing in Anglophone research outlets. But I am a bit afraid that placing too strong an emphasis on the burden of language barriers can turn our attention away from what it means for us to publish papers. What I am meaning is, when non-English speaking authors publish their research in their local non-Anglophone journals in their local language, it may be not because they are unsuccessful in overcoming language barriers, but because it is the best way from their own standpoint to maximize their publication impact in their own working context. Here, what seems important to me is that publishing has different mixed kinds of importance to us. For some, publishing is important primarily because it is about adding a piece of knowledge to the body of literature in the field. But for others, publishing is important because it is the way to engage with people with similar interests or concerns in the field, hoping for further opportunities for mutual learning and continuing collaboration. And of course, there are probably other ways to see the importance of publishing. So if we are serious about aiming to achieve global participation in science communication research without having overrepresentation or underrepresentation of a particular group of countries or particular geographic regions, maybe we need another empirical study on what journals are chosen by which authors, for what reasons. So probably it is about the end of my 5 minutes. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Everyone's keeping to time, which is fantastic. And I like your idea there at the end of looking at motivations for different journals from different authors, which sounds like something that would be a very interesting research topic. I'd like to welcome also Lynn from Vienna and Jose from one of my favorite parts of India, Kashmir. Welcome. So if you want to put on chat where you're from and what you're doing, that would add to our conversation here today. Our second speaker is the fabulous Fabien Medvecky from Otago University Centre for Science Communication. And he's going to talk about the lack of diversity in research topics that was found in the study. So thank you very much, Fabien.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, everyone. I'll do my best to keep to time, but it's unlikely to happen because it's after 8 at night here. And, you know, that's my excuse anyway. So the report stated a few things about the lack of diversity in topics, particularly highlighting that much of the research seems to be on the media, particularly print media, and quite a bit about public attitudes. And also, I think in a related way, it also showed a lack of diversity in the disciplines that are presented, primarily biological and environmental disciplines, less of others. And digging a bit deeper, it also highlights that science communication often don't decontextualize what discipline they're in. And one of the aspects that also affects, say, the diversity of topics noted in the report is the strong focus on controversies and areas that are kind of contentious. And so this made me think, what kind of controversies for me strike me as particularly important? So, you know, I'm thinking people like QAnon, right? And the QAnon shaman, or people like David Irvin, who, for those of you who don't know him, he's one of the leading Holocaust deniers. Clearly controversial topics, but what's interesting about them for me is that these are people we're blind to. They're not the publics that we'll talk about, because our friend here, the QAnon shaman, doesn't read print media. He primarily gets information from QChan and 4chan and other such channels. He is not in the kind of publics we look at. And funnily enough, when it comes to some aspects of science, for example, climate change, he's completely on board with the scientific consensus, completely against the consensus when it comes to COVID. But they're interesting because they fall out of our scope. They're people that we're blind to. And so there's a couple of things we might ask about this, and we might say, well, maybe it's fine. It's not our concern to look at them, and not our concern to look at contentious issues that are beyond the biophysical questions. But that's not clear to me that that's the case. And what it made me think is that fundamentally, whether or not we should focus on these people and on these topics, is what is the point of us doing research about science communication? What's actually a motivation? And that's one question that I kept wanting to have an answer to when I was reading the report. And it's not really in the report, but I think that's one of the most fundamental questions for science communication, both as a field and as a research field. Why are we doing this thing? Why do we get up in the morning to do this? What is it that drives us? What's the point of researching? Because until we can answer that question, then we can't really make meaningful recommendations. A recommendation is only going to follow given what we're trying to achieve, because some things will matter for some things, but not for others. If our aim as researchers is to see how information can be made more persuasive, then different research will be important. If our aim is to look at how people respond to different responses, the research will be different. And so I think getting a good grasp of what it is that we think matters, the purpose of why we do this research, is fundamental to determine the gaps, the shortfalls, and the strength of the existing research. And I think there's lots to be said about this. And I think it's one area that hasn't so far been discussed very much. So I'm really looking forward to kind of chatting about this with the participants of the panels, because for me, that's really kind of the core question that comes out when we think about the lack of diversity in topics. How did I go for time?
Excellent, Fabien, excellent. The reason you're so amazing is because of the absolutely fabulous Joan Leach, Professor Joan Leach, where you did your first postdoc location. And so I'd like to welcome Professor Joan Leach. She's the Director of the Centre for Public Awareness of Science at the Australian National University. She's going to particularly look at the lack of theory that was found in the sort of analysis that was done. So over to you, Joan.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you also, Alex and colleagues, for this really stimulating work. I mean, this is a great opportunity for us to talk about all kinds of things. And also, I know, Jenny, you were a researcher on this project, and I remember talking to you about this while you were doing it back in 2016. So thank you also to you and your other researcher colleagues. So I'll just limit a few comments to 3 categories. First is this notion of grand challenges for the field. And I loved these, and I love that the report kind of lays them out for us so that we can disagree. And Alex, you know, you and I have had many years of disagreement, productive disagreement, and I hope we have many, many more. But I want to think about the grand challenge you put for us around our disciplinary problem of science communication, and then say a little bit about what you found about science communication theory, which I think is really interesting, and then talk about the recommendations just for a minute. So, grand challenge. So the way you put it is that we're caught in established disciplinary structures and habits. And I think that's right. I think, sure, I mean, everybody, you know, every field has this problem. I think it's a lot more complex than that, though. It isn't just that people are importing, you know, theories or problems from sociology or science studies, and we need to find our own way. it's that we come from a huge, broad range of backgrounds. And I remember a former student of mine, sadly passed now, Melanie McKenzie, who did some fantastic work. And one of the things that she really left with me is how much of the fact that many of us have scientific backgrounds that we're importing into the field of science communication, how much that actually impacts the field. What questions we find interesting or important, what kinds of theories and methods we're willing to go after, how much empirical versus theoretical work we're willing to do. And I think that hasn't quite been parsed yet. And I think it's always a great discussion to talk to people about how they import their backgrounds into their work. This diagnosis of our stuckness is interesting. I'll also note that after your work, my colleague here at the ANU, who doesn't work in my center, Professor Gabriel Bammer, who works in population health, published a really, really interesting paper in SciComm online, you can find it, where she says, gosh, you know, what makes science communication as a field interesting is because it potentially could be part of the integrative transdisciplinary sciences. So exactly what you think is the problem for us, she sees as science communication offering a solution for a whole bunch of disciplines. You know, get a little SciComm and you can be more transdisciplinary and maybe even come up with some solutions to serious communication problems in those areas. So I thought that was a very interesting provocation. Whether you see it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether you believe the diagnosis, it's fabulous to discuss. Now, this theory issue, where we take our theories from, how important are theories to science communication. Really interesting that 41% of the papers that were coded make reference to science communication theory and its importance. We all believe it's important to build and create new concepts for the field. However, it still seemed from the research that 4 themes kind of really jumped out at me. One was that most of our theoretical structures are still talking about scientific literacy and public understanding of science. So we're kind of revisiting that theme over and over again. Who knows, maybe we've solved it. I'm not sure, but that seems to be driving a lot of our work. Second is this issue about the ways in which theory is driving our empirical design. And that seems to be a real problem, that it actually doesn't. A lot of our work is methodologically driven, but looking at case studies, or we're driving out of disciplines. We're not letting the problem set our theoretical concepts and then feed into our methodology. So that seems to be a problem, and that's something that I think those of us who work in programs that work with students, with master students and PhD students and with practitioners, that is really useful for us to spend a little bit more time thinking about. The other thing that struck me was listening to some of the editors that you quoted in the study from Public Understanding of Science or from Science Communication, and about the huge interest in papers that are theoretical in nature. So it isn't, and in their view, it's not the papers that are looking over one controversy or one case study that are getting the eyeballs. It's the one where we're actually doing some conceptual development. So the idea that we're interested in the conceptual development that other people are doing, I find that awesome. I find that a challenge. I find that something that is quite motivating. And then finally, and this has been mentioned, but I think this is something we're going to have to deal with. And I think, COVID, among other things, has exacerbated this trend. And that's to the small projects with little recommendations at the end that don't link up to a larger body of research in the field. And so we get this problem of case study after case study that don't kind of add up to anything. And I think that really came out very loudly from the research you did. Now, so what do we do about all this? Well, I think, finally, the last thing I'll mention are some of the recommendations that come out here about how we might develop our theoretical foundations, think about our disciplinary place in the world. And some of these recommendations are great. Mixed method approaches, let's collaborate. Since we do have this interdisciplinary space, we have a real opportunity to use a range of methods together to answer the problem instead of making things methodologically driven. So I thought that was a great suggestion. We need to examine these geographical, cultural, and economic you know, diverse issues of communicating science and innovation. We need to look around the world, be global. I think that's really coming out loud and clear. Link theory to practice, obviously, and we can discuss that more. People want to talk about that. I think it's a good thing to talk about. Although I'm still skeptical that theory and practice are so unlinked in science communication. People say this all the time. You'll have to show me the evidence. I still don't think it's here. I see people saying it, but I'm not sure I see the evidence of it myself. Replicate, wow, wouldn't that be an idea in science communication? Has any science communication work ever been replicated? I mean, maybe it has. If it has, I'd love to people put it in the chat or the Q&A. But yeah, let's replicate some stuff. You know, we did some analyses 20 years ago. Do they still hold? That'd be interesting. And be large scale. And I love that idea, especially right now. Because there are a lot of systemic problems that we have to solve, and the only way we're going to be able to answer those questions are with the kind of large scale projects. So you've left us with lots of things. The only one that wasn't there that I really, really wanted was some focus, and I think Fabien kind of hit on this, some focus on the kind of normative vision for science communication, right? Why are we doing this thing? You know, and that there are probably a multitude of reasons, but I think we do really need to talk about that right now. You know, and people can be motivated in different ways, and maybe that's how the field is going to be broken down into the future, where we gather under kind of our normative concerns rather than our methodological ones. That would be really interesting. So thank you for all this great work. There's so much to talk about. I will stop talking, even though I would love to go on and argue with all of you. But thank you. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much, Joan. Lots of provocative thoughts there as per usual, and I'm beginning to see some themes emerge for our discussion. But before we do that, I would like to turn to another reason why Fabien is fabulous, and that is his one-time boss, Professor Lloyd Davis at the University of Otago, who is currently the Stewart Professor of Science Communication. Thank you very much, Lloyd.
Hey, thanks, Jenny, and thanks to you and Alex, both for the research and for this opportunity to talk to everyone about it. And I'm going to follow on a little bit from Joan, but not necessarily in a way that's sympathetic, Joan. I mean, it will, I hope, provoke a little bit of discussion. And for me, I think there is a disconnect between science communication, research, and practice, which is highlighted in this report. And for me, it's the key issue that strikes at the very relevance of science communication as a discipline. And as Dietram Schiffel is quoted in the report as saying, we need an applied footprint, otherwise we're irrelevant. And I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. I think it absolutely is correct. And this is personal, but nothing exemplifies this more than the life of a man whose funeral I've just been to today, and that was Professor Phil Bishop. And for those of you that don't know Phil, he worked at the Center for Science Communication for a number of years and was its acting director in 2013. And Phil fell firmly into that practitioner camp. As a practitioner, he was wildly successful. He almost single-handedly brought the plight of the amphibians, and in particular frogs, to much of the world. He successfully mobilized conservation efforts, creating awareness, public understanding of science, and so forth. He could talk to schools, keep large halls engaged and enthralled, caught celebrities such as Jane Goodall, David Attenborough, and Peter Jackson to join his crusade. He ran social media campaigns that garnered millions of followers. He introduced a raft of initiatives to save frogs and their environments, and he helped change government policies. He's recognized nationally and internationally with many awards for his communication and his communication skills. But I think it's fair to say that Phil was not similarly well regarded in our own community of science communication researchers. He was perhaps dismissed is too strong a word, but he was regarded as a popularizer of science, as if that had little to do with science communication research. And for me, that is the bloody problem, if I can be so bold. There is almost a complete disconnect, I think, notwithstanding what you said, Joan, between the practitioners and what they're doing that works when it comes to communicating science to the public and what science communication research focuses on. And from my perspective, this is borne out by the results of the field analysis. And I think the issues are threefold. First, there's not an appropriate theoretical framework for science communication that is relevant to the practice and addresses what makes best practice. And the agonizing that goes on in our field about things like deficit model, one-way communication, participatory communication, and citizen science, in my view, that has been more of a diversion than helpful in this regard. And I think we need a more appropriate framework that brings in theories that are more appropriate to practice, such as marketing, narrative theory, visual literacy, and some of those were mentioned in the report. The second thing is that there's little science communication research, as is pointed out in the report, on actual practitioners. And that's clearly a disadvantage and a gap. And it's something that should be given research priority. And finally, I think language is the problem. We don't talk in a common language. I remember going to my first PCST conference in Malmo in 2008, and I was stunned how researchers and practitioners seem to be talking completely different languages. And this is exemplified in the field analysis by the fact that no practitioners pretty much read or even know about the three main journals for science communication research. That's an appalling statistic. That is, we have a field of research that's supposedly about science communication that is completely divorced from the actual act of science communication. It's like having biology researchers conducting research on Lamarckian theory while biologists in the field are doing something completely different, such as using Darwinian principles. And the recommendations of the report call for a common platform where the results of our research can be translated and made accessible for practitioners. But I don't think it's that simple. I think we have to do something far more radical to make science communication research relevant to practitioners. And take, for example, the recent spate of books about science communication. As excellent as they are for the most part preaching to us, the science communication researchers. The language is too dense, the subjects are often too esoteric to interest practitioners. Craig Cormick's book, The Science of Communicating Science, probably comes closest to bridging the void between science communication research and practice. But even it can sometimes get lost in all the research. What stands out in Craig's book, and it is something at the heart of Eric Jensen's and Alex's teaching, is that we need much better, much more rigorous evaluation of practice. And when we start doing that, I believe we'll make progress in bridging the void. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lloyd, and thank you to all of our discussants and to Alex for his presentation. Joan mentioned Melanie McKenzie, who died too early a few years ago, and her PhD was looking at values in science communication and the fact that we all bring values when we're involved in either the research of science communication or the practice of science communication. I would like to ask you what can be done to better understand motivations, and what will that tell us about research and practice? Who wants to go first?
Well, can I jump in so I can have a go at Lloyd? Yeah. It'll be fun. No, yeah. I actually don't want to have a go at Lloyd. I think what he observes is right, but I think what he takes away from it is not quite right. So thinking about motivation, I actually think that when you sit down with practitioners, which I do all the time, and you have a conversation about an issue in science communication, I find people very engaged in the research. I don't feel like there's resistance, and I find that most of the people I work with actually want to research things that are real and happening, and do. So I guess when you go to the motivation question, what's interesting is we might be motivated by more similar things than we initially think. So, you know, you brought up Phil, and he's just a great example of somebody who's had such great impact, you know, as you mentioned with amphibians and environment, sustainability issues. I think that motivates a lot of people working in science communication, whether they're doing so-called theory or practice. What I don't like is this kind of reification where you got to be doing one or the other, because what I see is a great blend. And I would even put Phil in that category of somebody who had really insightful, theoretical, research-informed things to say to a wide range of people. So I guess what I worry about is that we established that, oh, there's practitioners and there's researchers, and now we're going to go out and find them. And I think that's a little bit of what this report did. That's all.
I mean, one thing that I think Lloyd was saying in one of the questions was about the fact that you often get researchers go out and study practice, but you don't have practices driving research. And so maybe that's something that could be examined. But Alex wanted to contribute something about the two different viewpoints of Lloyd and Joan. So Alex.
Yeah, because it might not be as much of a controversy as we're trying to portray it, even though that's usually healthy for any discussions. And Lloyd already mentioned the manifesto for evidence-based science communication, which was published early last year. And that was based on, again, not my personal opinion or Lloyd's or Joan's, but there is empirical research analyzing how much awareness in the practitioners community is there for scholarship and how much willingness to incorporate it. And if some of the work that we've done ourselves is a highly representative and even stratified sample, which clearly shows, and technically the result was 0%. Of course, there's a standard deviation, which means there must be somewhere out of there in practice who actually regularly reads a journal, but technically it was 0. And if you look at how evaluation is done, yeah, and look into the methodologies and see how that informs them. Anyway, just quickly, the manifesto has a so-called knowledge cascade, because it's a problem that cascades downwards, and it starts with, first of all, the evidence not being acknowledged. We don't really know what is relevant. If we were to acknowledge this, the practitioners mostly can't access it because much of this is behind paywalls, which is in terms of open science in the 21st century, I think a fundamental issue. And once it has been accessed, so first of all acknowledged and relevant and accessed, then you have the jargon issue, which just has recently been shown very clearly in Ayelet Baram-Sabari's work on how much jargonization in the journal POS, for example, has increased over the last years. It's quite incredible, actually. So once there's actually access, then it's not transferable. It's not necessarily applicable. It's not, and even then we would see it as a one-way street, right? So where is the collaboration between those fields? Why can't we explore together what we should be doing the research on? Why don't we do it together in an action research sense of, let's say, okay, you've got this framework, let's put it into practice, let's experiment with it, let's prove or disprove what the hell you've been describing there, and vice versa.
Thanks, Alex. And I know people like Martin van der Sanden and others are doing that action research type process with practitioners, which is an interesting process. Fabien, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, do you think it matters what the motivations are to do research or to do the practice of science communication?
Yes, not in the sense that I think there is a right motivation, it's not in an absolute sense, but I think it matters because it determines whether or not the research we're doing is actually meaningful to what we're trying to do. And so, you know, in fact, if we want to think of kind of wading into this idea about whether or not practitioners are you know, the research applies to practitioners, well, it depends what we're trying to do with practitioners in the first place, right? It depends first on how we imagine the practitioner, because there isn't one practitioner. There's many practitioners of science communication, and we have some imagination about what it means to be a practitioner. And depending on how we imagine the practitioner, we'll imagine different kind of research questions around what they might do. But in all cases, we also want to think about what's the purpose of this. So I don't think it matters in the sense that we need to have one finite set answer about why we're doing science communication research. But we need to have some answers or other in order to be able to see whether the research we are doing is actually meaningful to what we're trying to answer. Otherwise, we're just doing basically like a pot-like set of research that doesn't actually lead us to anything in particular. So I think having this sense of motivation, of purpose for science communication? I think that's actually one of the biggest questions for science communication, very broadly. Right? What is it that we're trying to do? Why do we do this stuff? What does it even matter? I think that's a really profound question.
Yeah. Now, Mitsuru, before I go to the questions, you mentioned that you thought it was important to understand the motivations behind researchers doing science communication. What was your reasoning behind that?
So my reasoning, or?
Yeah, why do you think it's important to understand the motivations of people who do science communication research?
So the point I was trying to make in my contribution was that, even we tend to use this single term researcher to refer to those who are engaging with this research work. That's really diverse. That's, we are lacking the vocab to refer to all these, range of different reasons why they conduct this, the experiment and the data collection and analysis and reflection, etc. And the point I was making is that the choice of language is related to the purpose or reasons why they are, engaging with that activities. So the motivation is really important. And just in relation to that, I just want to quickly respond to the question I got from Siddharth. And so I have to apologize that I probably failed to convey my message. So my point wasn't to say that English is the best language, to maximize the research impact, but it may be the best choice for people who are seeking the impact on this, the body of knowledge of science communication. If we see the science communication as a universal enterprise, if that's the value that researcher has got, that's the best language probably in this today's research environment. But if the person who is conducting research has got more interest in contributing to their local practice or local conduct of public communication about science and technology, maybe English is not the best choice. And so that's again about the motivation.
Okay, thank you. And to end off the panel discussion before we go to questions, Lloyd, Joan had the first comments. You can have the last comments about this whole idea of motivations.
I was hoping you'd say I could have the last laugh, but it seems I get Joan's point, but I still subscribe to the view that Alex showed with the manifesto, and that is that we do have two communities. It's all very well to say there are some people that span both, and I would hope that I fit into both, but for a large part of the community, people are either in the research, science communication, research scholarship community, or they're in the practitioners community. And the vast majority of practitioners that I have interacted with reinforce the results of what Alex's sampling showed, which is that they don't care about public understanding of science or Journal of Science Communication. They do what works for them and what their colleagues do. And I don't think, as researchers, give enough credence to what practitioners are doing. And nor do I think we always approach it from the theory that's appropriate. And Joan, in her talk, you did mention about the questions we're asking and how we could be refocusing the questions and looking at why we're asking these questions. And I absolutely agree with that. I think we should be doing that. But I still think this fundamental issue exists, and we're not going to make it go away by just saying that there are people that span both, or the practitioners are equally interested in the scholarship. And I come back to what Dietram said, that we have to have an applied footprint. And if we don't, why are we studying science communication, which comes back to Fabien's point.
Yeah, there's an interesting little conversation happening on chat at the moment with Joan and Eric Jensen and Siddharth contributing about there being a research practice continuum. And I keep wanting to participate in this discussion because, as most of you know, this is a topic that I focused on in my PhD thesis, and I'm essentially a practitioner who does research occasionally. But, and I have very strong views about this, but I'm not going to contribute. So I'm the moderator of this discussion, so I'm not going to do that. Lynn Chiu has 3 votes on her question, which is, would you consider the communication of science between specialised disciplines, especially between science and the humanities and the arts, a type of science communication? And has the strong focus on public understanding of science excluded interdisciplinary communication as a proper type of science communication? That's an interesting one. I mean, I quite like Joan's point about the richness of different disciplines adding to our field of research and practice. But who would like to comment on Lynn's question? Fabien.
Yeah, I will, because I think that's a really, really, really sharp question. Actually, I think in a way it goes to what I was asking about, what is the motivation? Like, what is it that we think we do when we do science communication? I think it's fundamentally, my answer is yes, of course it is. If you're communicating to somebody who is not an expert in your field, then for me, that counts as a form of science communication. You have to go beyond your field of expertise. For me, that's, yes, it is. And this is where I think, you know, it's really, really gets messy around whether or not we are studying practitioners. And because if we say yes to this, and I would say yes to this, then in fact, academics who work across disciplines do science communication a whole lot of the time, just not in overt ways. But I think, for me, there is, you know, there is absolutely an element of being a science communicator when you're communicating across disciplines. The minute you have to think beyond the narrow scope of your discipline, where you have preset understandings and shared kind of assumptions, you have to move into this idea of, you know, communicating in a broader space. So for me, it's a yes.
Okay. Anyone else like to comment on that? No? Okay. So the next question that's got a couple of votes is about the need for practice to research flow of ideas and learnings. How can we enable and encourage that? How do we get people involved in practice to share their ideas and learnings with those involved in research? We often talk about it the other way, which is perhaps the deficit mindset trap of SCR researchers suggests. Joan, you're starting to type an answer. How about you give us the answer that you're about to type?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's happening already. You know, and I think that a lot of it's about co-design of research questions, where people want to know very particular things, and so folks that might. But I guess you know, this idea that practitioners are kind of rude empirics that kind of do what works for them without any theory of what is going on is a bit strange to me. So I think you know, co-designing that, working with people's experience. I think a lot of that is going on in some of the most interesting research that we have around, you know, boundary work and lots of stuff going on in the environmental space, like, you know, in co-design citizen science, that kind of stuff, which is already doing that. So I think we can encourage that kind of research. I think we can encourage people to be, you know, answering real questions. But I also think there's, you know, let's be careful here, because I think there's a huge, I think there's a huge task in front of us to build our concepts in science communication. I think practitioners can certainly contribute to that, no problem. I think they already do. But you know, you start kind of carving up the world in weird ways when you start thinking about practitioners versus researchers, and real questions versus theoretical questions. Like, all of a sudden you got this ontology that you've built that I don't think describes the world I live in. But co-design, right? Let's get together and work on these problems together. That's the obvious answer.
Alex, you had a comment about that too.
Yeah, I think it's easier said than done, because we would need to establish and even institutionalize totally new forms of transfer and collaboration, which at the moment are neither incentivized on the research and scholarly side, nor are they incentivized on the practice side. I often have done that, just recently with the Engage conference, for example, in the UK, and I ask at the beginning the question, if we want to tackle those grand challenges of our time, be it climate change and so on, like we would need more science communication, wouldn't we? We need more public engagement. We need to pump up the volume. And usually I get something between a 90 and a 100% confirmation rate, like on a Likert scale, extreme, like yes, absolutely, no doubt about it. And then I go into that question and say, well, how do you know that more is better? How do you know what is more? How do you know which kinds of more would be better compared to what? And that brings us back to, I think that connects this question here with this one that was raised before and also emphasized by Fabien and so on, what the French call the raison d'être, the reason or the normative vision, as I think Joan called it. Why are we doing this in the first place? And that accounts for both the research and the practice. So as long as we don't question the fact that the institutional self-promotion of an institution in academia, like most UK universities are now charities, and they basically have to compete with one another, and that competition is encouraged by the system of science, and we see it in the US, we see it increasingly in Russia, in China even, interestingly enough. So this internal competition breeds a marketing-driven machinery for institutional self-promotion, which, and I'm not saying that this is ethically or morally wrong or corrupt or whatever. That wouldn't be my call to say. But I think I should and I must ask the question as to whether that is, we already started out, is that what science communication was supposed to be? Is more of that necessarily better? And as long as there's no discourse between the scholarly community and the practitioners community as an exercise in reflexivity, if you want, to ask those questions, I don't think we're going to make significant progress on that front.
Thanks, Alex. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so if you vote on them, it makes it easier for me to know which ones to ask. I'm going to go to Craig Cormack's question because it's related to what we're talking about now. And he says, does the enormity and immediacy of the impact of COVID-19 and the information and disinformation around it provide an opportunity for these collaboration, unified approaches that we're talking about now, rather than discussing the differences between practitioners and theorists? Is this an opportunity for practitioners and theorists to work together? Who would like to
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, Lloyd.
Because this will follow on nicely from what Alex just said and responding to Joan, but also bringing to account Craig's point about the value of even talking about practitioners and researchers. And in essence, while it might seem like Joan and I disagree on certain aspects, I think from the sound of it, we actually do agree, because I actually don't think we should be talking about practitioners and researchers. And ideally, we want to have that collaboration. We want to have that so that we're not two communities, but we're one community. And I think that's maybe what Craig was suggesting, but which Alex was saying was a very hard thing to do. And certainly to answer Craig's question, I think issues like COVID provide the motivation, if nothing more than the funding motivation, to bring those two elements and others as well together. And I think that that is a good opportunity and we should exploit it or use it. But coming back to Alex's point, I think it's enormously hard to do these things. And one of the things that was in the field analysis, one of the recommendations, was that there should possibly even be not public understanding of science, not the Journal of Science Communication or Science Communication, but some other publication that is aimed not just at practitioners, but researchers as well, but it is somehow more inclusive. And for me, that seems like a no-brainer.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on the COVID drive? Okay, we might go to Tatiana's question about large international projects in science communication. She asked, what would they look like? And then she also says, there are international collaborations around COVID-19 on just about everything. Is there space for something on SciComm? You might like to know that I'm actually part of an international collaboration looking at some of the COVID-19 communication for the Rockefeller Center. But does anyone else want to answer that question?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, that was one of the recommendations from the report. But look, I mean, I think there are a lot of international collaborations going on. I think interestingly, there are kind of multiple models for this, and that you know, Tatiana's question is a very, very good one, how we think about how science communication fits into large interdisciplinary international collaboration. One is that we kind of sit on the edge, right, as science communication specialists that do the science communication bit of a big project. And there's a lot of that going on around COVID. And I know that many of my colleagues are involved in multiple ones of those. There's another model that would say, actually, there's some fundamental science communication questions that we haven't maybe yet identified. So everybody's talking about misinformation or disinformation, or and the complexity of that issue, which I think the complexity of that has not been acknowledged. And I think science communication, people have a lot to say about that hasn't yet been said. So it could be a big thematic kind of thing that's more based on science communication concepts and theories. You know, this idea of replication, like, I mean, you know, there are those among us who do, you know, really great empirical work. Why couldn't it look a little bit more like a clinical trial? You know, we haven't done anything like that kind of a big multi-hub kind of research in science communication. So the models for this are really interesting. And I think we're just beginning to touch this, you know, the surface of what is possible for our field. And so, yes, there are things that already exist, but I would hope that we could also explore other models, because right now it seems like many of them, we kind of sit on the side. Like we're one of a interdisciplinary team, but it isn't necessarily the science communication questions that are driving.
If I may very quickly.
Yes,
Jenny,
Alex.
I mean, John, a prerequisite for replication is replicability, as we all know, and whether that is the case with the lack of open methodology and open data and so on, I very much leave that as a rhetorical question. By far, most of the research in the field can't be replicated in the first place. Since the image of this shaman with the Viking hat was brought to our attention earlier, thanks for that, Fabien. I'm really wondering how much of what happened in the last, in that awkward year, 2020, which we're all going to erase from our memory at some point, I guess, how much of that, from a SciComm perspective, was unexpected? The policy and the mitigation measures by policy makers in most countries in the world did take the medical advice into account. Epidemiologists, virologists, they even took economic research into account. To which extent has social research, sociology, philosophy, media studies, communication science, marketing, to which extent has that been incorporated in the actual mitigation measures when it came to, okay, so we're shutting that country down. What does that mean for children growing up without the feeling that there are facial expressions because everyone's wearing a mask? What does that mean if they don't go to school for domestic violence and things like that? These are sociological issues. So what we've been investigating for a long time academically, the ethical, the legal, the social implications of the science is exactly this post-normal science situation that we've been experiencing. And we could, as you say, contribute so much, but is our governments listening? Is that being incorporated in policy making? I would love to say yes. Yeah, and there are activities like in the US, for example, where Dominique Broussard, for example, is involved in. There are activities like that, but for me, this is the exception than the rule. And as long as that's the case, then I must keep making the case for there is a disconnect between scholarship and practice, scholarship and policy, policy and practice, if you want. So maybe to use the German term of praxis might be something that could help solving that a little bit.
Thanks, Alex. This is one for you, Fabien, given you're the ethicist amongst us. What role does ethical issues in diverse regions play in affecting science communication and publication? And this links with another question, a few comments from Kirthi Divakaran and also Jason Major about cultural nuances and the effect of that on science communication and communicating in language and so on. So I'll turn to you first, Fabien, and then to you, Mitsuru, about the language and the culture. Fabien.
I mean, I think the ethical issues around why we do the research, how we do the research is huge. You know, because it affects not just what we publish, it affects also the kind of research we do. Some research are easier to publish than others. So we're more likely to do those if we are, you know, depending on our drive. I think it leads to a really complex question, back for me to the core question of why we do this thing, but also to the core incentive structures around what it is that we might be able to do. You know, as an academic, we get published, we get, you know, supported and promoted, and we get grants based on publications. It doesn't really matter whether a publication is meaningful to anyone, you know, it doesn't even matter really very much if people read our publications. What matters is that it gets published. So there's I think there's ethically, the challenge is the conflict between our individual ethos of what we might view to be valuable and important and the kind of things we might want to aspire to, versus the structural ethical kind of structures, the structural normative structures around what is counted as valuable institutionally. And I don't think these necessarily pull in the same direction. So I think that's the really kind of hard question as an individual, kind of as an acting researcher, is which kind of ethical pool do you follow, and how much sway do you allow that to have on what you do? And I have no good answer. I have a depleting glass of gin, unfortunately. That's it.
It is evening in New Zealand for all of those where it's morning and you're having breakfast and coffee or tea.
Yeah, this is not just a bad habit. Also a bad habit, but not a bad habit. But I think this is really one of the really tough ethical challenges in academia. You know, is our challenge is these multiple normative structures that we're embedded into. You know, we get, and anecdotally, I think one of the things that's really for me been fascinating. I've been doing some things around responsible innovation and this kind of embedding in a economic growth paradigm. And as much as I might like to think I don't want to embed it in this, still I want to get promoted and I want to get more money. So on a personal level, I'm as embedded in the things that I find problematic systematically at a social level. And I think this is where the kind of really problematic ethical challenges lay. I can give you a better
and
answer.
Alex responds to you by saying, "So true, Fabien," in the chat. So others can read that comment there. Mitsuru, I'd like you to have a look to comment, if you would, on cultural nuances and meaning and language and how that affects science communication.
Well, that's a huge question and very difficult to answer, but in relation to what I was presenting at the beginning of this webinar, I would say that we can spot ethical questions everywhere in the science communication research practice itself and the language itself. You know, if you take for example, post-colonial take on this, the dominance of the English as an imperialist language, that's one ethical question. And if we talk about the international collaboration on the COVID, there is a question regarding who's got the largest voice, the loudest voice, to set the agendas and research frameworks, and whose their theoretical lenses are brought in to set the languages and the way we talk about the frame, the issues, and etc. So it's the ethics can be discussed from a wide range of perspectives and viewpoints, as well as the standpoints, depending on where you want to identify yourself in this, the field of science communication research, and what's the agendas, what's the driving force behind that. So yeah, so I haven't got any clear answer to that big question, but that's kind of my take on that.
There are a load of other questions happening now. I'm going to ask one more, which is at the top of my list, and then I'm going to ask each of our panel for a closing comment about what they think should be the next step in the field of science communication research. So you can be thinking about that as well as Tom Carruthers' question, which is the question, whose responsibility is it to translate SciComm research so it's digestible by those in practice who don't come from a science research background? And he says, I wonder how many mathematicians could properly digest a JCOM paper. So, who would like to have a go at whose responsibility is it?
And vice versa, by the way.
Yes. Joan, whose responsibility is it? Is it centres of science communication like your own, or Lloyd, centres like your own, or Alex, centres like your own?
Yeah, look, I actually think we do have a responsibility to make our research, approachable for a whole range of people who might want to use it or just interested in it, and we do. You know, there are blogs, there are podcasts, there are all kinds of, you know, videos, all that kind of stuff. And I think it is our responsibility, just like it's any kind of publicly funded research needs to be, you know, it needs to be accountable to the public. So yeah, I do think it's our responsibility, but I get a little bit nervous. There's a little bit of an anti-intellectual tone that starts to creep in when people start saying, oh, well, there's too much jargon in science communication research. There's too much, you know. Well, yeah, maybe there is, because you actually need some of that to do the conceptual and empirical work. And so, yes, it is our job to be accountable and transparent and to reach out as much as we possibly can. But at the same time, you know, research is still research. And I don't think we need to apologize for that. I think we need to be like the scientists that we aim to help, and be responsible and transparent, and to spend a little bit of time talking to a range of potential stakeholders, whether you want to call them practitioners or whether you want to call them students or whether you want to call them publics, fine with me. Yeah, we need to get out there too and talk about why our work's important.
Okay, Alex writes in the comments, digestibility of research is important, but transferability and relevance is more important. So that's something else to think about. So we're coming to the last statement from each of you, and that is, well, what is the next step now that we have this research? So Alec, what's the next step in one sentence, please?
Well, we said that multidisciplinarity is both a challenge and an opportunity. And if the same accounts for transdisciplinarity, then I think it's not enough to just try to merely transfer abstract expert knowledge into practice, but the science communication field needs more transdisciplinarity, as it was mentioned. Transdisciplinary means of collaboratively investigating, optimizing SciComm from within, so to speak, using real world data to develop both research and practice through the same initiatives without comprising quality standards on either side. It's a long sentence, but it's a much more complex challenge which needs totally different transfer mechanisms and platforms than let's say, English language abstracts in a Spanish journal. That's, yeah, fair enough, let's do that, but that's not going to solve the issue.
Okay, thank you for that very long sentence, Alex. Lloyd, a sentence from you, what's next?
I honestly think that one of the saddest things for me, looking at the history of science communication over the last 30 odd years or so, is that the same old issues keep coming up and we don't make much progress. And I think that we need to do some of those things that Alex and the report were talking about in order to make progress. And I particularly think we need to bring more rigor to the way we approach all science communication research in terms of things like repeatability and the statistics we use and things like that, as well as trying to bring together these people who are regarded as practitioners and making things relevant for them.
Thank you for another very long sentence. And might I say, I like the moustache and beard, Lloyd. Mitsuru, you're next.
So I see this, the evidence-based science communication or building, you know, global body of knowledge of science communication as a growing trend in this field. But so probably the next step for me is to seek another interpretation of science communication, so to run in parallel with that big trend. So paying attention to what cannot be taken into that, the evidence-based discourse or more, you know, scientific discourse, something like that, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Mitsuru. And Fabien.
One sentence, I would say, to have a good, coherent, meaningful sense of why we get up in the morning to do what we do. And to actually work on that as opposed to just doing a bunch of randomly scattered things. Knowing our motivation.
Thank you very much. Excellent. And Joan, the last sentence from you.
Okay. I think we need to co-design more of our research with a wider variety of people, and I'll say people, And I think we need to work on the normative frameworks within which we work, which is partially what Fabien said, but I think also broader than that. And that's about the aims and ends of science communication. And I think, quite practically, Lloyd, that we need to have more conversations like this. And really thank you to Alex and you, Jenny, and the team, because it's these, you know, when we can disagree and then find the contours of our disagreement and kind of pull them apart and put them back together and argue a bit more. That's really how the field's going to develop. And we have so few opportunities to do that. So more of this, please. Thank you.
Yes, I think this has been a wonderful discussion. So thank you to you all. Thank you, Alex, for organising it and for making the research publicly available. Hopefully it will stimulate many more discussions around the world. And thank you, everyone. Let's keep having a conversation. Goodbye, good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may happen to be.